pretty much for the first part of this, you probably don't need notes, but everything is in there. The text is fairly straightforward until we get to the last verse today. Then things become a lot more complicated. So we're in Hebrews. Today is the start of chapter 3. I'll be covering the first 5.5 verses, introduction to that statement in verse 6. But so let's start by opening in prayer, and then we'll read the text. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for the warmer weather that we're enjoying now, and it was frigid for a while, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time outside, but we could still look out the window and marvel at your creation, the beautiful snow, and Lord, now the beautiful front lawn that's starting to emerge from that snow has just brought joy to my heart this morning. So we thank you for that. We pray, Father, that we'd be attentive, that we would listen intently to teaching and preaching, and Lord, that we'd be involved in our worship of you, body and soul. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, let's go ahead and just quickly read the first 6 verses in Hebrews chapter 3. So therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all of his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. Okay, so what I've decided this week is, because that last verse is difficult, and we'll understand what the difficulties are in that. I want to go through the first 5 fairly quickly, and then I want to take a little detour and talk about conditional sentences in the Greek. There's some concepts that would be useful to have in hand as we're going through these conditional sentences. We're going to have the same issue next week in verse 14. Okay, another conditional sentence. So chapter 3 starts with the infamous word therefore. Therefore. And whenever you see therefore in the biblical text, you pause and take issue here and think, okay, why the therefore? What is it that the author is trying to convey here? Well, many times the author is now going to perhaps draw a conclusion based on everything that has been said up to that point, or perhaps issue a command of some kind based on everything that he said before. Here in Hebrews 3, turns out to be the latter. He's going to issue the first command in Hebrews. Okay, so if he's asking you to think about and do something based on what he's already said, you ask the question, all right, what was the content now of the first 2 chapters? Okay, in the first 2 chapters, the letter to Hebrews, it starts off with just some basic ideas about revelation in the Old Testament, that it was piecemeal, it didn't all come at once. But now that the Son has come, he is the embodiment of revelation. And he now embarks on a comparison between the Son and angels. Angels were highly revered in Judaism. And so the author demonstrates that the Son is superior to the angels, and he quotes 7 Old Testament passages with various teachings in there. He's the creator. The Lord God himself calls the Son God. He's the sustainer of all the things. He created the angels. The angels are commanded to worship him. All these things demonstrate that the Son is superior to the angels. And then in chapter 2, We have the kind of a warning that the Son, having given some revelation, and that carries some responsibility. We need to pay attention to that and not neglect it. And he goes into a short discussion about how man was given the rulership of the earth, and that Jesus, in order to effect our salvation, he became a man also, so that he could die in our place. And he makes the comment that he didn't do this for the angels. The angels don't get that kind of help there. Okay? So, that's all the things that he's asking you to keep in your mind with the therefore. Therefore, based on all this stuff, the demonstration that the Son is superior to the angels, the first command is going to be issued. But before he issues that command, he addresses the readers in a personal way. He calls them holy brothers, holy brethren. Okay, holy brethren. I think this is clear, at least one indication, that the author here of Hebrews is writing to believers. It's going to be more and more difficult as Hebrews goes along to hold the position that he's talking to unbelievers or professing believers. It's going to be more difficult as we go. Now, that's not going to make some of these warning passages any easier to deal with, because if these are warnings to believers, okay, we really need to understand exactly what the warning passages are about. And then he calls them an additional thing, which is a very unique way of addressing believers in the New Testament. Matter of fact, this is the only place that this is said. He says they are partakers of a heavenly calling, partakers of a heavenly calling. Now, what could this heavenly calling actually be? And a lot of times when you come upon a task and a text and you ask a question like that, it may very well be that the author is either has already mentioned that in some way, or he's going to mention it. And I think that partakers of a heavenly calling is probably looking back to how he referenced in chapter 2, so great a salvation. So great a salvation. I think there's at least in the author's mind, that's what he means by heavenly calling. Okay, and that it's interesting that passage there. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? If we neglect that calling, he tells us back there that this comes with responsibilities. If the old law, that was given by Moses through angels came with responsibilities, and the Son is greater than the angels, then the things that he brought will also incur, some responsibilities. Okay? And that's not new to the gospel in the New Testament. Paul tells us that in a couple of places. Ephesians 4:1, he says, walk in a manner worthy of the calling by which you have been called. He writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy, he called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which is granted us in Christ Jesus from all eternity. Okay, so Paul is very fond of mentioning, hey, there are some responsibilities that come with the gospel message, with all of this stuff. But remember, Paul couldn't have written Hebrews because the theology is just too different, right? It's just too different. Sarcasm off, right? So we come to the first command now in the book of Hebrews, and that command is simply this: consider. Second person plural, you all consider. Consider. What does consider mean? Pay careful attention to what's coming here. Very cerebral kind of command here. Okay, What is it that the author is asking us to consider? Consider Jesus. Consider Jesus. Okay? We don't have to go too far in the text to follow what he's saying. You are to think about him very carefully and understand what it is that you are contemplating about him. And what is it that we are specifically to think about him? Go on in the text, right? Go on in the text. He is called the apostle and high priest of our confession. The apostle and high priest of our confession. Now, that second one, the high priest of our confession, we kind of get that right off the bat, right? We understand what was the purpose of the high priest. He'd go into the Holy of Holies once a year, the Day of Atonement, make a sacrifice for the sins of all the people, yada, 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 all that kind of stuff. Jesus, likewise, gave himself as a sacrifice for all of us. We inherently understand how Jesus functions as our high priest. That's not really, difficult. That we get that's an easy one. But what about apostle? That's a different way of asking us to consider Christ. Christ as an apostle, our apostle of our confession. In every other case of the word apostle in the New Testament, it either refers to the 12 or Paul. That's it. This is a single use where apostle is being attributed to the Lord Jesus here. Okay? So we ask, what sense is Jesus an apostle? That's a question that we should ask. Yes. Marcus always is stealing the thunder, right? He's always good at seeing ahead. Actually, up until chapter 4 and like verse 14, where it said, consider Jesus the high priest of our, I think the apostleship is that's what he's talking about here. That's where he's going. But what is an apostle? What does the word actually mean? Okay, it means someone who is sent, right? Sent to deliver words from an authority, and that person has all the authority of the sender. So if we view Jesus as an apostle, if an apostle is one that's sent, who sent Jesus? God the Father. Okay, any doubts about that? If you have doubts, go and read the Upper Room Discourse, okay, which is John 13 through 17. A dozen times Jesus says the Father sent him. There's no doubt about it that the Father sent him. Okay. There may also be another thing. Don't forget, who's the audience here? These are Jewish believers, possibly Jewish priests, but certainly Jewish believers. And when they hear, the word apostle in the Greek, it's apostolo. That's I'm sending. I'm going to send someone. And it may be that the author of Hebrews is, kind of conveying the burning bush scene where God himself literally says, Moses, I am sending you. I am sending you to Pharaoh. Okay? That certainly could be in the author's mind. Okay? Now, how is he like an apostle? How are we to consider him and stuff? Well, like Moses was sent to the Egyptians. from God, and he brought in a new age of revelation, the Old Testament law. So Jesus also came and brought in a new age of revelation from God. Okay, and it is interesting. I always thought it was interesting that back uh, in chapter 2, you've got those signs that he mentions that with the gospel and the those who spoke the words of the gospel, namely the apostles, God testified with them the truthfulness of the message of the gospel with the miracles, with the signs and the wonders. Okay, who else displayed a tremendous signs and miracles, in his ministry? Moses. So he doesn't say Moses yet, but I think to a Jewish mind, they're reading this first, phrase and the first two chapters. They're starting now to think, what about Moses? Okay, you've demonstrated the superiority of the Son to the angels, but hey, there were plenty of Jews that thought Moses was even above the angels. Okay, so if you're a Jew, you're reading this and you're thinking, okay, he's got to start bringing Moses in here, and he certainly he does. He's kind of building that up. Okay, on to verse 2. So he says, he was faithful to him who appointed him. Okay, interesting that most of the modern translations break this Greek sentence up, all one Greek sentence, into a new sentence. This actually starts with a participle here. Uh, a wooden literal translation would be, uh, the apostle and high priest of our confession, being faithful to him. Okay, being faithful to him would be the sense. It's a continuous, it's a present um, participle, though all the modern English translations translate it in the past. He was faithful. Okay, um, who appointed him? God did, right? God did. What did he appoint him to? To be an apostle and high priest. Okay, and what he's asserting here, the author, is that, and what he's going to continue in these couple of verses is that one of the main attributes of the ministry of Moses and of the Lord Jesus was their faithfulness. Okay, their faithfulness. Um, because the text actually goes on. He says, he, Jesus, was faithful to him who appointed him. He completed everything that God gave him to do, and he did it faithfully without wavering. And the text says, as Moses also was in his house. So now he introduces Moses, finally. And Moses is that second pillar in Judaism that Jews revered. And he is going to, over the course of a couple of verses here, demonstrate that Jesus, the Son, is superior to Moses, too, to Moses. The text says, as Moses was faithful in all of his house. Okay, now I put in there a little bit of emphasis. The word, was faithful is not there in that second clause. As Moses was faithful. That's, we were borrowing the verb from the first piece of it. As Moses was faithful also in his house. Okay. But now we got a few questions to ponder here. It says, was faithful in all his house. The first question is, whose house? Whose house? It says his house. Who is his referring to? And then the second thing is, what is the term house referring to, in this context? What is it referring to? So the first question, whose house? ordinarily, normal rules of grammar, even in Greek, the nearest antecedent would provide, the reference for a personal pronoun like his. Okay? And if that's the case, this would simply be a statement. Moses was faithful in all his house, all of his household. It'd probably be a reference that, he was a faithful husband, his kids were under control, all that kind of stuff. It would be more a statement about Moses' household. But I think the later context in in his comparison with Christ, I think it probably negates that. What I think really is going on here, again, we're a Jew thinking through this, reading through this. There is a very likely important Old Testament context that the author probably has in mind that goes back to the events recorded in Numbers 12. Okay, let me summarize what Numbers 12 was about in case you didn't read that this morning in your Bible read through. Okay, right? Numbers 12, Aaron and Miriam come to Moses and say, hey, how come you're the one that only speaks for God? Kind of challenging his authority. God says, and this is my paraphrase, time out, huddle, all you three, come on over to the tent, the door of the tent of meetings. I'm going to chat with you. Okay, he chastises Aaron and Miriam, and he says this significant thing about Moses. God says concerning Moses that he is faithful in all my house, in all my household. It's very likely that to a Jewish reader, this is what the author of Hebrews means by his house. Not Moses' house, but God's house. Okay? Again, it's very likely that the personal pronoun here, his, is a reference to God, not Moses. Okay, not Moses. And in fact, you have some choices, a couple of different choices that the translators have decided. In the NASB, they translate his with a capital H. They go for the, when we see deity and a pronoun, we're going to capitalize it. Okay, so his, capital H, is a reference to God. And something like the ESV, and the NIV, they just put the word God in there. Faithful in all of God's household. They just put it right in there, right? Which is kind. Yes, Valerie. Capitalize H? Yes. So that's a reference to deity, and that would pertain to God. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. But he's not the Hebrews. He's not really commenting on Aaron. He's commenting on Moses. He said Moses was faithful in all of my household. Okay, so that answers the first question, and certainly people a lot smarter than all of us have decided that God, or capital H here, is the meaning there, even though the nearest antecedent is Moses. And then the second question, what does the term house mean in this context? Okay, well, where did God speak those words to Miriam and Aaron? He spoke those words at the door of the tabernacle. Okay, it may be that he's referring to the house simply as a reference to the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God at the time. And what does it mean that Moses is faithful in all of his house? Probably that he was faithful to construct the tabernacle according to the exact specifications that he gave him. And in Exodus, the end of Exodus, that last chapter, the erection of the tabernacle is complete. It says Moses did that to my exact specification, and it was put up on that day, and that's when they started worshiping there. Okay, now, house could also be a reference to the house of Israel, the people of God, as a house. That's certainly imagery that's prevalent in the Old Testament. So it just means he's faithful in all of my house, the nation of Jews that that he was part of. He executed his duties and responsibilities as God's appointed prophet, that kind of stuff. He did that faithfully. Okay, either of those is okay here, and given the comparison that's going to be drawn later on, we are, his house. Either one of those, I think, would fit. Um, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time scratching our heads. Got to get to the bottom of this. Which one is it, or is it something else? Okay, it's beyond the point of what the author here is trying to convey. Okay, I think the house of Israel fits better, but I'm not totally committed to that. Okay, going on. Verse 3, he goes on with his comparison. He's going to extrapolate a little bit. He said Moses was faithful. He says that he, the son, is counted worthy of more glory than Moses based on one simple thing. The builder of the house has more honor than the house. And he's saying that Jesus, or God, was the builder of the nation of Israel, was the builder of the tabernacle, the designer, that kind of stuff, whichever way you see that. And so because of that, the son is worthy of more glory than Moses. Okay, than Moses. Okay. We're going through quickly because I need a half an hour to cover the conditional stuff. Goes on in verse 4, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Okay, the builder of all things is God. He's greater than Moses simply because he created all things. All things. That including God's house, which is a subset of all things, right? So if he deserves more glory for building the house, and that shows he's superior to Moses, that's the subset of the house, or the superset is all things. Right? He's created all things, so that's even more so that he is superior to Moses. He created Moses, exactly. Part of it, a subset of the house. Yeah, he was a member of that house. Yeah, exactly. Okay, now on to verse 5. Things are getting a little more interesting. He makes another comparison. He says that Moses was faithful in all his house. Again, his house would be God's house here. He's faithful in his house as a servant. Okay. Moses was a servant in the house, and the comparison between Moses and the son actually will complete in verse 6, where it says, Jesus was a son in that house. And what's the difference between a servant and a son in a Jewish household? Enormous amount. Okay, son is the heir of that. He's the possessor of it. Okay, all of that stuff. Okay, Moses was faithful, but he was just a servant in the house. Okay, and then there's a pretty unusual phrase. It says, "For a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later." That is a lot of English words for two Greek words. It reminds me of, the comedy skit. You got the, two powers, and you got the guy that's acting as a translator, and the question, are these terms acceptable to you? And blah, 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 for 10 minutes, and then the translator says no. That's kind of what this is. There's a lot of English required to translate one noun and a participle here. Okay, he gave a testimony to things that would be spoken of later. Okay, now what does testimony mean? Testimony. Speak out loud, evidence, witness. Witness to it, proof, that kind of thing. Proof of what? Witness to what? things spoken later. Fairly obscure and abstract. Not much detail that the author is doing. You ask, well, what things? What things is the author trying to get into the Jewish mind here? Okay? Because he doesn't exactly say anything. Can we speculate? Sure, we can always speculate, right? But there's nothing in the text here. Doesn't tell us. If you go out there and look at some commentaries, you'll find lots of opinions on what those things are. Could be the gospel. Okay. How did Moses testify to the gospel, though? I'm not sure how you get there. Uh, unless you view, Moses' whole ministry as like preparatory, kind of like John the Baptist. He prepared the way with the Old Testament law for Christ. Maybe that's how you get there. Um, Second, could refer to Moses would eventually give the law to the nation of Israel. Okay, I'm not sure that gets you there either. I think it may be because he's comparing Moses with Christ. The author of Hebrews is actually wanting a Jewish reader to recall Deuteronomy 18, where Moses says that God is going to raise up another prophet in the future, and he's going to say things to you, and you need to listen to him. Okay, you need to listen to him. Yeah, they did. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And he is talking to believers, so they should know these things that Christ is superior to Moses. But what is the conjecture of lots of expositors about why the epistle was written? There may have been some Jews, maybe they were priests, that were tempted to go back to Judaism to avoid the persecution that they were enduring at the hands of the Jews and the Romans, that kind of stuff. It's possible. Okay, so it's not clear exactly what testimony that Moses gave that refers to things spoken later, but he certainly proclaimed that there would be things spoken by another prophet in the future, and that may be where things are given. Okay. Now, I want to skip a little bit here in the notes. Let's get to the comparison as it continues. So, the first part of that comparison, Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant. It completes here in verse 6. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house. Okay. Kind of the old, but. When you hear but, doesn't necessarily mean, forget everything I said, it's not true kind of thing. You're a handsome guy, but, you're dumb as a box of rocks, that kind of stuff. That's not it. He's drawing the comparison. Moses was a servant. He was faithful as a servant, but Christ was faithful as a son. Okay, stepping up, the thing. Okay, there's the comparison. Again, the son is superior to Moses because he was a son, not a servant. Okay, even though he did servant type things and he acted as a servant, which is interesting. Then the author goes on to inject a personal aspect here. He says Christ was faithful as a son over his house. Then he says, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. I'm going to delay that second part, the if part of that, really analyzing this conditional sentence until next week. I really need to cover some additional things, but there is some very interesting nuance here over the first part of that. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house. The question now becomes, are we still talking about the same house as before? Okay? Because here the nearest antecedent is Christ, and at least in lots of places in the New Testament, well, he's a pretty good antecedent for a lot of things, right? Are we talking about the same house? The Greek certainly leaves it totally ambiguous. Okay, it's just the personal pronoun again there that we would translate his. Okay, there are some decisions that have been made across other translations. Matter of fact, ESV inserts God in there. He was he was faithful as a son over God's house. They insert that. That's what they said. They said, nope, hasn't changed. Same house as we were talking about up there in verse 2. The NASB, you know, not wanting to probably make a choice, just uses the capitalization of the pronoun to reference deity. Okay? Doesn't really say. But, interesting, the King James and the New King James renders it his own. He was faithful as a son over his own house. And now we're talking about a different house. We're talking about a different house. So you can see the tension in translators is what to do at this particular point. Okay, is there a change of house here? Okay, now theologians will argue and bash their heads, ram each other together, and argue about how that should be rendered, but the author of Hebrews is just making a comparison here between Moses as a servant and Jesus as the son. He's not trying to give us some theological treatise of whether we as the church are a separate house now, or whether that we all belong to the whole house of God as a people and that kind of. He's not trying to make that theological distinction at all. He's just making a simple comparison, and theologians will argue, and even translators will argue, how it should be. Because how you translate that, you could read into the translation certain theological ramifications. That's not the point the author's trying to make. He's trying to make a simple comparison. He's not trying to make a theological treatise on, is the church a separate entity from, the house of Israel? We as dispensationalists would say yes, but probably wouldn't translate his own house. Marcus. Yeah, yeah. It is a direct comparison between Moses and the son. Yes. Yeah. Yes. He's the heir. The servant doesn't have, rights to an inheritance, unless the father gives them an inheritance, right? Which also was possible. Okay. Now, at the end of that, we got verse 6. Whose house we are if we hold fast to our confidence and boast of our hope firm until the end. Okay? If you look down to verse 13, we are going to have a similar conditional sentence, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. Okay, and what I think would be very beneficial is to talk a little bit about conditional sentences in Greek. Okay, not not. I mean, they're fairly straightforward, but the interpretation can be complex. And at least in this case, I think it's complex, and we should really take a little bit of time to talk about the generalities of conditional sentences in Greek. It's going to have a major impact on our interpretation. I think this will be fun and enlightening too. Okay, what is a conditional sentence? Okay, it is a sentence that generally follows if this, then that, or if this, that kind of stuff. It's something that contains an if statement. Okay, now you might be surprised to know that there are more than 600 occurrences of conditional sentences in the Greek New Testament. Most of them, certainly occur in the epistles. And those 600, those are just the ones that have the explicit word if in the Greek as part of it. There are other conditional sentences, a handful that don't have that, but they are still conditional sentences. Okay? Now, some terminology. Okay? The conjecture in the if part of your conditional statements, if some phrase, that phrase is called the protasis. The pro meaning pre, before, the first part of it. That's how I kind of remember it. The then part is called the apodosis. Now, why learn those terms? Because if you read a commentary, the commentators are going to refer to those pieces of a conditional sentence with those terms. So it's just at least useful to know. Protasis comes first, apodosis, after. Okay, that's the normal rendering. If protasis, apodosis, what comes after. So just terminology. Now, grammarians separate conditional sentences in the Greek into classes. And those classes are rather trivial to identify. Okay, you look at the Greek text, you know immediately this is a first class condition, this is a second, this is a third, that kind of stuff. It's how the word if, there are a couple of different words that are translated if. That tells you what type of condition it is. And the tenses of the verbs used in the protasis and apodosis. That also is a marker to tell you what class it is. Now, ordinarily I'd go into that. What are the different classes? Not needed in this case. Not needed. Sometime down the road, if we hit Hebrew text and that's important, I'll cover that. But for our discussion next week, that's not important. What is important is to understand in these conditional sentences how the protasis relates to the apodosis, how the if part relates to the then part. That's of critical importance with how we're going to look at a conditional sentence and how we look at verse 6 and verse 14. Very important. So, all of these New Testament scholars have taken those 600 conditional sentences in the Greek, they've analyzed them, and they said, okay, here are the relationships that exist between the protasis and apodosis. We have them in 3 different categories. Okay? The first one is the normal, what you usually would assume in English, if this, then that. That's called the cause-effect relationship between the protasis and the apodosis. The protasis is the cause of the apodosis, okay? The effect. It is the cause of it. So, for example, and it is always useful to have examples. 1 Corinthians 2:8. Okay, it's the conditional sentence. If they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Okay, Paul's talking about the wisdom that he brings in preaching the gospel. He's not bringing, foolish words or trickery or that kind of stuff. He's bringing wisdom of the ages to these people, and he makes a reference to the rulers of the time of Christ. If they had understood that wisdom, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Okay? Here, the Protestants, they had understood. If they had understood it, that is the cause of they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. Okay? Cause and effect. Okay? Matthew 4:9, another example. Now, in the Greek, it's not absolutely necessary that you have the if statement has to come first. You could actually have the result or the effect come first. Just the different stylism in the author. Matthew 4:9, you actually have the apodosis comes first and then the protasis. He says, all these things I will give you, Satan speaking to Christ at his temptation, if you fall down and worship me. Okay? Now, when I see them reversed there, I always like to, just in my mind, let's read it in normal order. Does it still make sense or does it make better sense? Okay? If you fall down and worship me, okay, the cause will be what? I will give these to you. That's the effect. Okay? The cause is Christ bowing down and worshiping Satan. The effect will be all these things I will give to you. Okay? That's the cause and effect. Okay, now, majority of New Testament conditional sentences are in this category. They're in this category. Okay. A second relationship that the scholars have analyzed is called the evidence inference relationship. Okay. In this case, the speaker he's inferring something. Okay, the then part, the apodosis, from some evidence that he sees. He's stating that, the protasis. Okay? In this particular thing, and this is important, okay, if it's an evidence inference relationship, the protasis is not the cause of the apodosis. It's not the cause of it. Okay? Here's our example. 1 Corinthians 15:44. Paul's talking about spiritual bodies and glorified bodies, that kind of stuff. He says, if there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Okay? And so the point here, this is, an evidence inference type conditional statement because the physical body doesn't cause the spiritual body, right? Doesn't cause the spiritual body. Paul's merely inferring that there must be a spiritual body based on the evidence of the existence of a physical one, right? That's all he's saying here. It's not the cause of the spiritual body. It's evidence of the spiritual body, okay? That's going to be an important distinction as we go on, okay? And there's one final relationship, and that's one of equivalence. And that's just simply the example, James 2:11. If you commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. These things are kind of equivalent. One doesn't cause the other. They're equivalent. If this, same thing stated in a different manner. They're equivalent here. Okay. Now, talk a little bit about how you use or how you can misuse a conditional statement as you're reading through. And this is critically important because it's going to come into play in the interpretation of verse 6 here, the conditional statement in verse 6. And that is that the converse of a conditional statement is almost never true. Okay, what do I mean by the converse? If you swap the apodosis and the protasis, if you swap them, okay, it's not true. Almost never is it true. And the example is if we take Paul's statement up there, if there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body, and we swap the two and say, if there is a spiritual body, there is a physical body. That clearly is not true. And the angels are the case in point. Those are the example. They have spiritual bodies, but the existence of an angelic physical body doesn't follow from the existence of the spiritual one. Okay? So it's not true. Okay? And I mentioned here in the notes, you're guaranteed to get in trouble if you start assuming that the converse of a conditional statement you see in the text of Scripture, if you assume that's true, you are going to get into some trouble. Guaranteed. Okay? Now, here's another example. If she is married, she has a ring on her finger. Okay? Is the converse of that true? If she has a ring on her finger, she is married. Obviously not, right? It's not true. Okay, not true. Now, here's another category where you can get into trouble. If you assume that the negative of the conditions in the statement, those are usually false also. For example, take the original, if she's married, she has a ring on her finger, negate it. If she is not married, she doesn't have a ring on her finger. Well, that's not necessarily true either, right? Not necessarily true either. So when you approach these conditional sentences, really behooves you to read it at face value and not try to say, oh, well, that means the converse must be true as well. That's not the case. And many times it's wildly not the case. Now, we have 5 more minutes. That's probably enough. Let's look at Hebrews 3:6 now, because this is interesting. It says, essentially, we are his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. Okay? Why is this a difficult passage to interpret? Well, if you just read commentaries on that, you're going to find 2 main camps out there in the interpretive world. Okay? You're going to have the Arminian folks that say, well, this, we're comfortable if he's writing to believers, and we assume that, you're writing to believers. They're saying this says that the, assurity of your salvation depends on you and your holding fast. Okay, you're the one that has to maintain it, and they, of course, do believe that you can lose your salvation. Okay, and what is, the essential problem with that interpretation? Okay, carefully here. This verse, if you look at it just at face value, it appears, I'm going to use that word strongly, it appears to say that our present state of being in his house, we are in his house as believers, that present state is dependent on some future events. If we hold fast, if we keep going, if this and all of that, okay? That's a very strange grammatical way to make a point, that a present state depends on something in the future. And it's even more pronounced in verse 14, where this is now a past event. We have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast. It seems to say that a past event actually depends on something in the future. So grammatically, we got some serious tension here that we got to sort out. Now, what is it that those that believe you can lose your salvation, how do they tend to see this? Well, they tend to view this by taking the negatives of the conditions here, okay, and say, hey, if we don't hold fast, then we aren't in his house. And of course, they say, okay, I'm going to hold fast tomorrow, so I'll be in his house. But yeah, the next day, I probably won't hold fast, so I'll be out of the house. Okay? And they're okay with that. They'd be very comfortable with that, that you are the one that maintains your own salvation. Okay? They would be perfectly comfortable with that. So, um, now, on the other hand, the other major category of interpreters would be those in the Reformed or the Calvinistic camp, and they would tend to think that this warning is not really given to true believers, but only to professing believers. Okay, and they tend to take the converse of the condition here and say, look, if you are in his house, then you will hold fast. That's like the whole perseverance of the saints, the P and tulip there in the Calvinistic camp, and most of the those that preach this verse and expound on it are going to take the converse and really spend their time preaching and teaching on that. But that's not what the text says. That's not what the text says. Okay? Now, the issue, the almost the foundational issue is the author of Hebrews writing to believers? Next week, that's where I'm going to start. We're going to show all the different ways in the book of Hebrews that the author references his audience. And you're going to see there's no way that there's any room that he's not speaking to believers here. The way he references all of them in so many different ways, there's not a better description of a body of Christians anywhere else in the New Testament, I think. Okay, but at the same time now, if he's speaking to believers, now we have to deal with the difficulties of what that text says on its face value. So ponder that for a week. Be uncomfortable with it. Think of it through. I think there's a very simple, once you admit he must be talking to believers, okay, there's a way to understand what he's saying in the context of the rest of chapter 3. So wrestle through that for the week and come back next week and we'll wrestle with it some more. And I think we'll get to a point that we'll answer both verse 6 and verse 14. Let me stop there. We're 2 minutes over, but questions? I know this is a lot. It's a little bit technical. Got the notes. Go home, digest it a little bit, think it through. But that's where we'll start next week. Let me open the floor. Questions?